The slave markets of Louisiana were a theater of misery and greed. But that morning in 1847, something shifted in the air. Traders who had long become numb to human suffering found themselves whispering, pointing, unable to look away from what stepped off the wagon. She was unlike any they had seen. Her frame towered over men who prided themselves on their size, standing close to 7 feet tall, shoulders wide as the doors of a barn, muscles visible even through the tattered linen that clung to her body. Yet it wasn't her height that silenced the marketplace. It was her stillness. She stood perfectly calm, her gaze fixed ahead, unflinching as men shouted bids and others prodded her arms, as though testing the strength of an animal. There was no fear, no pleading in her eyes, only something vast and unreadable, as if she had seen the worst the world could offer and found it wanting. Rumors began before the bidding even started. Some said she'd been captured from a slave ship bound for Cuba that ran aground off the Gulf. Others insisted she was born in the interior of Africa, among tribes whose warriors were said to stand taller than kings. One trader swore she had been found in chains already, but no forge could hold her. The men joked nervously, yet there was a tremor in their voices. They were accustomed to breaking spirits, not to being stared down by them. When she was led on to the auction platform, the wooden boards beneath her creaked in protest. The auctioneer cleared his throat, but even his voice faltered. He tried to describe her as if she were livestock, strong back, healthy teeth, suitable for heavy labor. But the words fell flat. The crowd didn't see a worker. They saw a presence, a woman who stood too tall, too composed for this world of degradation. The air was heavy, the sun beating down on faces slick with sweat, and yet it felt colder, as though a shadow had fallen over the square. Among those present was Colonel Harlan Devereaux, a name spoken with both envy and dread. His plantation, Elysian Fields, stretched over 5,000 acres of sugarcane and misery. He was a man who believed order was maintained by fear, and he was proud of how well he enforced it. When he first saw the towering woman on the stage, he didn't see danger. He saw a challenge, and something else, something darker. He leaned to his overseer and muttered, "She'll fetch a price, but she'll fetch my curiosity first." The overseer said nothing. He'd seen what happened when Devereaux's curiosity was piqued. The bidding began low, hesitant. No one wanted to be the first to claim her. It wasn't superstition, though there was plenty of that, but an instinctive awareness that something about her violated the order of things. A slave was meant to look down, to tremble, to shrink. This one stood tall, silent, with the patience of a storm gathering at sea. Devereaux's bid came suddenly, so high it silenced the crowd. No one dared counter. The auctioneer's gavel struck wood with a sound that echoed too long in the air. She was led toward her new master's carriage, her wrists bound with thick hemp rope. Even then, the handlers seemed reluctant to touch her. She walked in silence, her pace measured, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Devereaux watched her every step, noting the way she carried herself, like someone who belonged to no one. When she passed a group of enslaved men unloading cargo, they paused, stunned. They had seen strong people before, but never anyone who radiated such control. Some lowered their heads and whispered words in an old tongue, fragments of a prayer or perhaps a warning. The journey to the plantation took 2 days. Devereaux rode ahead, and she sat in the wagon behind, shackled at wrists and ankles, guarded by 2 armed men who never took their hands off their weapons. They avoided speaking to her. When they stopped at night, they tied her to a tree, though. Both swore the knots had been tight enough to hold a bull. By dawn, she was standing beside the wagon, free, the rope lying on the ground as if it had slipped loose on its own. They said nothing to the colonel. To admit it would be to invite punishment, and both men valued their tongues. When they arrived at Elysian Fields, the sun was sinking, its orange light spilling over the endless rows of cane. The plantation stood like a scar against the land. Fields, stretching to the horizon, cabins lined in strict, cruel order, and the great house towering above it all like a monument to arrogance. The workers stopped to stare as the wagon passed, their eyes wide, their whispers carrying through the humid air. They recognized power when they saw it, and they also recognized danger. The colonel's wife, a pale woman with cold eyes, watched from the veranda. "You paid too much for that one," she said. Devereaux only smiled, his teeth gleaming under his mustache. "You'll see," he replied. "No one will speak of rebellion again once they see what becomes of the tall one." That evening, she was taken to the yard, where new slaves were branded with Devereaux's initials, a ritual of control masquerading as necessity. The iron hissed in the fire, glowing red. The overseer approached, sweat running down his face. He pressed the brand to her shoulder. There was the sharp scent of burning flesh, the hiss of iron meeting skin. She did not scream. She did not move. The overseer's hand trembled. "Did you hear that?" he whispered after a moment. The others shook their heads. "Exactly," he said. She didn't make a sound. That night, when she was locked in the holding cabin, the others avoided her. They sat huddled in corners, muttering prayers, glancing her way as though afraid she might disappear or transform before their eyes. She sat upright, her back against the wall, her eyes reflecting the faint glow of the oil lamp. Outside, crickets chirped and the wind stirred through the cane fields, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. Devereaux watched from his window in the big house, his glass of whiskey untouched. He told himself he had brought her to work, to show the others what happened to those who resisted. But deep down, another thought coiled within him, one he dared not speak. He wanted to understand her, to control her, to break her the way he broke men twice her size. But as the night deepened and the wind rose, something unsettled him. He could hear the faint sound of chains clinking from the holding yard, a rhythm too steady to be random. It was as if someone were testing them, measuring their limits, one link at a time. When the sound finally stopped, silence settled over the plantation like a weight. Devereaux drank his whiskey in one swallow, though the taste felt bitter and wrong. The next morning, the overseer found her standing in the yard. The chains that had been locked around her wrists lay in two neat halves on the ground, broken clean through. She said nothing. The men stared, not daring to move. Somewhere deep inside them, something primitive stirred, a memory older than fear. The overseer called for Devereaux, his voice shaking. But even before the colonel arrived, everyone knew something had changed. From that moment, Elysian Fields would never be the same. Colonel Harlan Devereaux had built his empire from cruelty, carved from the sweat and blood of others. He was a man born into wealth, but not patience, and his wealth had only sharpened his appetites. His plantation, Elysian Fields, was both a kingdom and a prison, its beauty masking the rot beneath. When he brought the towering woman, Annika, into his domain, it was not just as property. It was as a riddle he intended to solve. To him, she was a creature of fascination, an enigma that defied every rule he thought he understood about human will. He believed every person had a breaking point. It was how he maintained order, how he reminded himself of his power. But when he looked at her silent and unyielding, he saw no weakness. It enraged him, but even more, it intrigued him. In the days after her arrival, Devereaux watched her from the veranda as she was sent to work in the cane fields. Her motions were deliberate and efficient. She cut through the tall green stalks with methodical precision, never seeming to tire, never complaining under the burning Louisiana sun. The overseers shouted commands, their whips cracking in the air, but she obeyed neither quickly nor slowly. She obeyed as if on her own terms. When she stood upright, her silhouette rose above the others like a specter, and for the first time, the overseers felt a tremor of unease they couldn't explain. It was as though the fields themselves bent subtly around her presence. Devereaux noticed this, and it unsettled him. He told himself she was merely an unusually strong woman, flesh and bone like all the rest. But deep inside, a thought began to gnaw at him. Power was supposed to belong to him alone. Yet here was someone who seemed untouched by his authority, someone whose silence carried more defiance than 1,000 screams. He began to dream of her at night, dreams where he stood in his great hall, only to see her at the end of it, her face half lit by firelight, the chains he'd placed upon her dragging behind like shadows. In the dream, she never moved, but the distance between them always closed, no matter how far he stepped back. He would wake drenched in sweat, furious with himself for fearing something he owned. His wife noticed the change first. She had grown accustomed to his tempers and his cruelties, but this was something different. At dinner, he would sit in silence, his gaze drifting toward the window that overlooked the fields. Once, she asked him, "What is it about her?" He didn't answer. She pressed again. "You act as though she were some spirit come to haunt you." He smiled without humor and replied, "Perhaps she is, but if so, she's mine to command." His wife said no more. She had seen what happened. To anything or anyone he could not control, Devereaux's obsession deepened quietly. He began visiting the fields under the pretense of inspection, watching her work. Sometimes he ordered her brought to the yard, demanding to see her strength tested. He'd have the blacksmith forge new chains, thicker than before, claiming the last ones were defective. He wanted to see her restrained, wanted to watch her yield. But she never did. Even when bound, there was no panic in her eyes, only that cold, distant awareness that seemed to mirror his own cruelty back at him. The other enslaved people began to whisper. They said the colonel had met his match. Some claimed she could not be harmed by iron, that the pain from the brand had not even blistered her skin. Others said she spoke to the wind at night, her voice low and steady, calling on something older than any of them could name. It was superstition, perhaps, but it frightened the overseers more than they would admit. Devereaux's pride would not allow him to acknowledge it, but he felt the same chill. He told himself she was testing him, that she sought to humiliate him by remaining unmoved. He began to invent reasons to punish her. Once, when a worker dropped a crate of tools near her feet, Devereaux claimed it was her fault, that she had distracted the man. He ordered her whipped, though the overseer hesitated. "Sir, she hasn't done—" Devereaux's glare silenced him. "Do it," he said. The whip cracked across her back once, twice, 3 times. The sound tore through the humid air like thunder. She did not cry out. She did not bow her head. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the colonel, as though daring him to continue. After the 5th strike, the whip split. The overseer dropped it, trembling. Devereaux felt something coil tight in his chest, a mix of anger and something else he could not name. He dismissed the men and returned to his house, his pulse hammering. That night he didn't sleep. He began to spend his evenings in his study, surrounded by ledgers and books he never opened. The sound of the night filled the room, the rustle of the cane fields, the hum of cicadas, and somewhere, faintly, the echo of a chain dragging across dirt. He would tell himself it was the wind, but when he glanced out the window, he could see the glow of the workers' lamps, and among them, her shape, tall, still, watching the horizon as though waiting for something. His wife found him one night, staring out at the fields. "You've let her poison your mind," she said softly. "She's not a woman to you anymore. She's a mirror. You see yourself in her, and it frightens you." He turned to her slowly, his face pale. "I don't fear her," he said. "I fear what she makes me think about." The next day, he ordered her moved closer to the main house, under the excuse of supervision. He wanted her near him, wanted to see her every day, to remind himself of his control. Yet her proximity only deepened his unrest. When she passed by, the air seemed to shift. Even the dogs, fierce creatures that tore at the throats of escaped men, whined and backed away from her. The servants crossed themselves when she entered the yard. One afternoon, as a storm gathered over the fields, Devereaux called her to the veranda. She stood at the bottom of the steps, the wind pulling at her torn clothes, rain beginning to fall in slow, heavy drops. He looked down at her, clutching a riding crop in his hand. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. She said nothing. "I own this land, every stone, every soul. You work because I command it. You live because I allow it." For a moment, lightning flashed, illuminating her face. She looked up at him, not with hatred, but with a calm so complete it was unbearable. In that silence, he felt something crumble inside him. The words he had meant to say died in his throat. For the first time in his life, he felt small. When she turned to walk away, he called after her, his voice cracking with fury, but she didn't stop. The rain fell harder, washing the dust from the steps, and the colonel stood there alone, his knuckles white around the crop. Behind him the sky rumbled. Inside him, something darker stirred. He began to realize that power meant nothing when faced with something that did not fear it. That thought, more than any rebellion, was what haunted him. It followed him through every waking hour, whispering that control was only an illusion, and that somewhere in the vastness of the world, he had finally met someone who knew it too. The rumors began quietly, as they always did, spread in whispers between tired hands and hushed breaths in the moonlight. In the quarters of the enslaved, words moved like smoke, curling through cracks and shadows, impossible to contain. The sigh. Men and women who worked under the lash of Elysian fields spoke of her in tones they did not use for the living. They said she was not born from a woman, but from the storm itself, that thunder had carved her bones and lightning had filled her blood. To them, she was both a warning and a promise. They called her Annika the Unbroken. At first, the overseers dismissed the talk as superstition. Every plantation had its myths, tales told to make the unbearable seem part of something larger. But these whispers did not fade. They grew. Workers claimed they had seen her lift a fallen ox from a ditch, without aid. Others said that when she walked past, the air changed, as though the earth itself drew breath. The overseers began to notice strange things too. Nothing they could explain, nothing they dared to speak of openly. Tools left overnight near her. Cabin were found twisted or cracked by morning. Chains that had held her wrists showed stress marks no man could account for. The blacksmith swore that he had reforged her shackles 3 times, and each time they came undone without a single broken lock. One evening, a boy assigned to carry water to the fields swore that he saw her standing by the river, speaking softly into the current. Her lips moved, but the sound that came was not English, nor any language he knew. He said the water rippled outward in perfect circles, though no wind blew. When he told his mother, she slapped him across the face, warning him never to repeat such words again. But that night she lit a candle and whispered a prayer to the old gods she had abandoned when she was brought across the ocean. The overseers began to avoid her eyes. They did not like the way she looked at them, steady, unblinking, as if she saw something in them that even they didn't recognize. Men who prided themselves on cruelty found themselves hesitating before giving her orders. When they did, they shouted louder than necessary, as though trying to convince themselves of their own authority. She obeyed without resistance, but her obedience never felt like submission. It felt like tolerance, as though she allowed their commands because they amused her. Among the enslaved, her presence changed the rhythm of life. Where despair had once hung thick in the air, there was now something else, an edge of expectation. Men worked with straighter backs. Women hummed songs older than the land they toiled on. Even the children, who had learned to move silently, began to watch her with wide, unblinking eyes. Hope, once a fragile thing that wilted under the sun, began to grow in secret corners. They did not dare to call it that, but it moved among them all the same. Devereaux sensed it before he understood it. He noticed how quickly the work slowed when she passed, how the laughter that once came only from the overseers began to echo faintly from the fields. It was small at first, easy to ignore, but it gnawed at him. He felt her influence like a current beneath calm water. She never spoke out, never raised her hand in defiance, but her silence carried a weight that threatened to collapse everything he had built. One afternoon he sent for her. She stood before him in the courtyard, her body marked by the sun, her face unreadable. He asked her questions meant to break her composure. Where she was born, how she came to be sold, what she believed in. But she answered only in fragments, when she chose to answer at all. Her voice was low, her words measured, and when she spoke, it was as though each syllable was carved from stone. When he demanded to know if she feared him, she looked him in the eyes and said quietly, Fear is for those who have something left to lose. He struck her for the insolence, but when his hand met her skin, she did not flinch. His palm burned afterward, as though the force had rebounded through him. He sent her away, trembling with anger, though he could not explain why his hands shook, long after she was gone. That night, the plantation was restless. Dogs barked at nothing, their eyes glowing in the torchlight. The wind moved through the cane like a whispering crowd. The field hands claimed they saw shadows that didn't belong to any man. One woman swore she saw Annika walking along the fence line, her wrists unbound, though she had been locked in her quarters at dusk. The overseers dismissed it as nerves, but when they went to check, the lock on her door was open, the hinges warped as though heated from within. She was inside, seated on the floor, calm and silent, her eyes closed as if in prayer. By the next morning, the rumors had turned into conviction. No one doubted her strength anymore. They began to believe she could not be hurt, that the earth itself obeyed her will. When a tree fell in the fields during a storm, narrowly missing several workers, they said she had looked up moments before, her gaze fixed on the exact branch that would break. When a fever swept through the quarters, she alone remained untouched, tending to the sick with a strange patience. Those who recovered claimed she had laid her hand on their foreheads and whispered words they couldn't recall. Devereaux heard these stories and dismissed them publicly, but privately he was unnerved. He knew that fear was the foundation of his power, and if the enslaved stopped fearing him, his control would crumble. Yet he also understood that open punishment could make her into a martyr, and so he watched, waiting for an opportunity to remind everyone that he was still master. Weeks later, a group of overseers caught a young man sneaking food to the quarters. They dragged him to the yard, intending to make an example of him. Devereaux ordered the punishment to begin, but before the first lash fell, Annika stepped forward. She placed herself between the boy and the whip without a word. The overseer hesitated, looking to the colonel for instruction. "Move her," Devereaux said through gritted teeth. The overseer tried, but she did not budge. It was as though she were rooted to the earth itself. "Do it," the colonel repeated, his voice rising. The overseer lifted the whip, but before it struck, the handle snapped in half, splintering in his hands. The sound echoed like a gunshot. For a moment, no one breathed. Then Devereaux shouted, ordering her seized. The men closed in, but even as they did, none of them wanted to touch her. They reached for her arms and froze when her gaze met theirs. One by one, their courage faltered. The colonel stood there, his face red with rage, but there was nothing he could do. From that day forward, the plantation lived in tension. The slaves worked, the overseers shouted, but something fundamental had shifted. The old order had cracked, though Devereaux refused to admit it. The whispers continued, quieter now but stronger, deeper. They no longer spoke of Annika as a woman. They spoke of her as a force, an omen of change, a storm that had not yet broken. And though no one dared say it aloud, each of them, even Devereaux himself, knew the same truth. Something unstoppable had awakened, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed them all. The blacksmith's forge burned late into the night, its fire painting the darkness with a deep red glow. The air smelled of iron, sweat, and fear. Colonel Devereaux had ordered new restraints for Annika, heavier, thicker, forged from the hardest metal in New Orleans. The last chains had failed, not once but twice, and the overseers had begun to whisper that no mortal bond could contain her. The colonel refused to believe it. He saw every failure as a challenge to his authority, a wound to his pride that needed cauterizing. He stood beside the forge that evening, watching sparks leap into the humid air, his jaw tight as he demanded perfection. "Double-link them," he said. "No weak spots. If she breaks these, I'll hang you with what's left." The blacksmith nodded silently, too afraid to meet his master's eyes. When the new chains were delivered the next morning, they were a thing of brutal beauty, thick as a man's wrist, blackened by fire, cold to the touch. They clanked like thunder when carried. Devereaux ordered the overseers to gather every man on the plantation. "Let them all see," he said. "Let them witness what happens when myth meets iron." The workers were herded into the yard under the punishing sun. The cane fields swayed behind them, their whispers drowned beneath the metallic rhythm of chains being dragged across dirt. Annika was brought out by 2 guards, her wrists already bound by rope. She did not resist. Her face was calm, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as though she saw something far beyond the plantation's edge. The colonel stood on the veranda, whip coiled in one hand, pride burning like liquor in his veins. "Bring her here," he commanded. The blacksmith stepped forward, his hands trembling. He fastened the chains around her wrists, his hammer echoing with each strike of the rivet. The sound was sharp, metallic, final. When he was done, Annika's arms were pulled taut between 2 wooden posts. The iron bit into her skin, but she remained motionless. The colonel watched her closely, waiting for a flicker of pain, a trace of fear, but there was none. The only sound was the distant hum of cicadas and the nervous shifting of feet among the gathered crowd. Devereaux raised his voice. "You believe in legends," he said, addressing the enslaved men and women before him. "You whisper about spirits, about monsters who can't be bound. But I'll show you today. Iron bends for no one. Flesh breaks. Bone gives way. Every myth ends in fire." He turned to the overseers. "Pull the chains." 2 men on either side began to crank the winches. The chains tightened, groaning under the strain. Annika's arms stretched, her muscles standing out like braided rope beneath her skin. Still, she made no sound. The men strained harder. One of them looked toward Devereaux, uncertain, sweat pouring down his neck. The colonel nodded sharply. More. The posts creaked. The ground seemed to vibrate under the tension. The crowd of workers looked on, their faces pale with a mix of fear and awe. Then, without warning, a sharp metallic crack split the air. One of the links snapped clean through, whirling into the dirt like a bullet. The men staggered back. The blacksmith swore under his breath. Devereaux's expression froze. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he barked, "Again!" The overseers replaced the broken link and began anew, this time with every ounce of strength they could muster. The chains stretched once more, the air filling with the sound of grinding metal. But the impossible happened again. Another link snapped. Then another. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The colonel's whip fell from his hand. "Hold her!" he shouted, his voice breaking. But before anyone could move, Annika lowered her head, and the last of the chains gave way with a noise that was neither scream nor shatter but something deeper, like the earth splitting open. The broken lengths of iron dropped to the ground with a hollow thud. She stood there, free once more, the sunlight glinting off the fragments at her feet. No one dared breathe. Devereaux stepped forward slowly, rage twisting his features into something unrecognizable. "You think this means anything?" he hissed. "You think I won't break you?" His voice was low now, almost trembling. "Your flesh. You bleed." Annika looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time that day. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, almost gentle. "You can break what you own," she said, "but you do not own me." The colonel struck her across the face, his hand connecting. With a sound that silenced even the wind, she didn't move. He hit her again, harder. Still nothing. It was as though the force of his rage disappeared the moment it reached her. He stumbled back, his breath coming fast, his eyes wild. The overseers stepped forward, unsure of what to do, but she simply turned away from him and began walking back toward the fields. No one tried to stop her. That night, the plantation was silent in a way that made the air heavy. The workers didn't speak. Even the crickets seemed to fall quiet. The overseers drank themselves sick in the barn, muttering about what they'd seen, arguing over whether it had really happened. The blacksmith, unable to sleep, went to his forge and stared at the remains of the broken links. He tested one in his hand, running his fingers along the edge. The metal wasn't cut or filed. It was twisted apart, fibers of steel frayed like thread. He dropped it into the dirt, crossed himself, and whispered a prayer he hadn't said in years. Devereaux, alone in his study, poured himself a glass of brandy and stared into the flames. His hands trembled. He could not erase the sound of the chains snapping, the way the air seemed to vibrate afterward. He told himself it was a trick, some flaw in the metal, some hidden weakness. But he knew better. He had seen her eyes. They had not burned with fury nor hatred, but something worse. Certainty. The kind of certainty that makes fear feel inevitable. He stayed awake until dawn, the fire dying to ash beside him. When the first light of morning broke through the windows, he saw the faint outline of something outside, the posts where she had been bound. The ground around them was scorched, blackened in a perfect circle. No fire had been set there, yet the earth itself seemed burned. In the days that followed, the plantation's rhythm began to falter. Workers moved more slowly, their glances more defiant. Overseers barked orders but found themselves ignored more often than before. And through it all, Annika remained silent, her presence like gravity, inescapable, unyielding. The legend that had begun as whispers now lived openly. In the hearts of all who saw her, they believed that no chain, no man, no force of this earth could bind her again. Devereaux tried to restore control, issuing harsher punishments, doubling the hours in the fields, but it only deepened the tension. The men feared her. Yes, but more than that, they began to draw strength from her. When they looked at her, they saw something the colonel could never destroy, the proof that even iron could fail. The sound of breaking chains lingered in their minds, echoing long after the yard had emptied. To some, it was terror. To others, it was the first breath of freedom. And though no one dared to speak of it aloud in Devereaux's presence, they all knew that something had shifted forever. The fear that had once bound them had begun to rust. Rain fell across the Louisiana cane fields in thick, slanted sheets that evening, turning the earth to black mud and the air to mist. The plantation felt strangely alive. Every window shutter creaked, every tree limb groaned as if warning of what was to come. Inside the main house, Colonel Devereaux sat in his study, his whiskey glass trembling slightly in his hand. The fire in the hearth had burned low, its light flickering across the portraits of his ancestors, stern-faced men in powdered wigs who seemed to watch him with disapproval. For the first time in his life, Devereaux felt something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't guilt, and it wasn't shame. It was smaller, sharper, something that sat in the pit of his stomach and refused to move. Fear. Outside, the workers had been sent to their cabins early. The overseers, though drunk, whispered among themselves about what they'd seen that morning. Annika had walked into the fields barefoot, her steps leaving prints in the wet soil that filled slowly with rain. The broken chains still lay scattered. Near the posts where she'd been bound, half buried now under mud, no one dared touch them. One man said he'd seen smoke rising from where her wrists had been bound, as if her skin had burned the iron itself. Another claimed that when she looked at him, the ground under his feet had shifted. They were stories, wild, frightened stories, but none who told them laughed. Devereaux couldn't get her voice out of his head. "You do not own me." The words replayed like a curse, echoing through his skull long after she'd spoken them. He had broken men for less, killed them even, and yet something in her calm had unnerved him in a way violence never could. He told himself that fear was for fools and preachers, but when he looked into the window and saw his reflection, pale, sweating, and older than he remembered, he saw the truth. He was afraid of her, not because of her size or strength, but because she had shown him something he could not control. That night, as the rain grew heavier, the colonel ordered 6 men to guard her cabin. "No one leaves, no one approaches," he said, his voice low and shaking with unspoken anger. "If she steps outside, you stop her. If she resists, you kill her." The men nodded but didn't meet his eyes. Each was armed with a musket, a knife, and a length of chain. They stood outside her cabin in the downpour, the light from their lanterns flickering like dying stars. Inside, Annika sat silently on the floor, her wrists wrapped in rags, her eyes closed. The storm beat against the roof, but her breathing was slow even. calm in a way that unsettled those watching from the shadows. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The guards shifted uneasily, their nerves worn thin by the sound of thunder and the rustling of the cane. Then, around the second hour, one of them noticed something strange. The rain had stopped, not faded, not slowed, but stopped entirely. The plantation fell into a silence so complete it made the men's ears ring. No wind, no insects, nothing. A lantern flickered, then another went out. The man nearest the door whispered, "She's moving." But no one had seen her step outside. The cabin door remained closed, the latch untouched. And yet, there she was. A dark figure, tall and still, standing just beyond the line of light. Her face was hidden by shadow, but they could see her outline, broad-shouldered, towering, unmistakable. The first man raised his musket. His voice cracked as he shouted for her to stop. She didn't. The musket fired, the explosion lighting up the rainless night for an instant, and when the smoke cleared, she was gone. Vanished into the dark. The men began shouting, stumbling through the mud, their lanterns swinging wildly. Then came the sound, a deep metallic groan like iron being bent in half. One of the men turned toward it and froze. The broken chains, those same thick black links that had fallen in the yard, were moving, crawling, almost, through the mud as though drawn by some invisible force. They snaked toward the guards, dragging across the ground with a hiss. The men fired blindly, screaming for help, but their shots vanished into the blackness. A figure emerged through the mist. She wasn't running. She walked, slow and deliberate, the ground trembling slightly under each step. The chains slithered toward her feet, wrapping loosely around her ankles and wrists, not to bind her, but to follow. The men panicked. One swung his lantern at her. She caught it with one hand and crushed it. Another tried to stab her, but she caught his wrist mid-air and twisted until bones snapped. He fell wordless, the sound lost in the storm that suddenly returned with a deafening crash of thunder. By morning, 6 bodies lay scattered around the cabin, their faces frozen in terror, their weapons bent or shattered. No wounds, no signs of struggle, only the marks of enormous pressure, as if they had been crushed by something unseen. The plantation awoke to the news like it was a fever dream. The overseers searched for her, but Annika was gone. Her cabin was empty, her footprints ending abruptly at the edge of the swamp. The air there smelled of ozone and metal, and no bird dared sing. When Devereaux heard the report, he went pale. He demanded that search parties be sent into the marshes, but none would go, not even for money. By sunset, the colonel himself took up a rifle and went alone. He followed the prints until they disappeared in the reeds, shouting her name into the fog. No answer came, only the slow, steady drip of rain from the trees and the low rumble of thunder in the distance. He wandered deeper until the ground began to sink beneath his boots. The smell of rot filled his lungs. He thought he saw something move, a tall shadow between the trees, too still to be wind, too human to be anything else. He raised his rifle, hands trembling. Then he heard her voice again, carried through the mist. "You do not own me." The rifle slipped from his hands. He turned and ran, stumbling through the muck, the swamp swallowing his shouts. When he reached the edge of the field again, his coat was torn, his face streaked with mud. He locked himself in the house that night and didn't come out again for 3 days. When he finally did, his hair had gone white at the temples, and his eyes had the distant look of a man who'd seen something he couldn't explain. The official story told later was simple. The slave woman escaped during the storm, killing 6 men in the process. But those who had seen the aftermath whispered something different. They said there were no signs of struggle. The ground had not been disturbed, the mud undisturbed except for the faint outline of a single enormous footprint pressed deep into the earth, too large to belong to any woman, too perfect to have been made by human weight. The legend spread like wildfire. Locals began calling her the Iron Widow, saying she wandered the swamps at night, dragging her broken chains behind her, the sound of clinking iron announcing her approach. Others swore they saw her standing at the edge of the fields when the storms rolled in, watching silently as lightning split the sky. To the enslaved, she became a symbol, not of terror, but of vengeance, of something eternal and unbound. To the masters, she was a warning written in blood and rain. That power once broken never returns the same. Colonel Devereux's plantation never recovered. Within a year, the fields went fallow, the workers gone, the house decaying in the humid air. The colonel himself was found one morning slumped over his desk, the broken fragment of a chain clasped in his hand, his face twisted in fear. The forge, that once rang with iron, had gone cold, and the sound of clinking chains still echoed through the swamp whenever the wind rose. In the weeks that followed the storm, the plantation ceased to breathe. The once bustling fields turned still, the overseers left without orders, and the remaining workers moved through the property like shadows, silent, cautious, always looking toward the swamp when the wind shifted. The colonel's house, once a monument to Southern pride, now stood as a shell of itself. Windows remained shuttered even during daylight, and the fires burned low no matter how much wood was thrown in. Colonel Devereux had aged in days what would have taken years. His posture was bent, his eyes hollow, and his hands never seemed to stop shaking. He would sit for hours in his study, staring at the rusted remains of a broken shackle that he kept on his desk. He claimed it was for remembrance, proof that he had once controlled what now haunted him. But the truth was simpler. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Servants whispered that he no longer slept. Some said they heard him pacing the halls at night, muttering to himself. Others swore they saw him standing on the veranda before dawn, staring out toward the swamp where Annika had disappeared. Each night, the same ritual repeated. He would pour himself a glass of brandy, load his pistol, and sit before the dying fire until the first light crept through the curtains. The men he had left were too frightened to question him. They tended the fields out of habit, but their songs were gone, their rhythm broken. The plantation was no longer a place of life. It was waiting, suspended in some quiet horror. Then came the dreams. Devereux began to speak of them to no one but himself, yet the evidence of their toll was visible to all. He'd wake with deep scratches on his arms, mud on his boots, and soot under his fingernails, though he never left his room. In those dreams, she came to him, not as the woman she had been, but as something larger, cloaked in mist and moonlight, her eyes like mirrors of firelight reflecting his own fear back at him. She never spoke, never moved, but he could feel her presence pressing against him, heavy and suffocating. He would wake gasping, the sound of chains rattling faintly in the corners of the room where no wind could reach. As the nights grew longer, Devereux's paranoia deepened. He dismissed what remained of his staff, convinced they were whispering about him. He boarded the windows, had the front gate locked, and ordered that no one approach the main house after dusk. He told himself he was securing the property, but the truth was, he was building a fortress against something he could neither name nor understand. Still, even behind his barricades, the sounds persisted. The faint clink of metal in the distance, footsteps in the hall when no one walked there. The scent of rain and iron drifting through cracks in the floor. One evening, as twilight bled into night, a preacher arrived from Baton Rouge, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a voice that trembled when he spoke of spirits. He had heard rumors of the Iron Widow and came seeking to cleanse the plantation. The colonel, though outwardly skeptical, allowed it. Anything, he thought, that might end the whispers. The preacher walked through the halls clutching a Bible so worn it seemed ready to crumble. He prayed aloud, sprinkling water that smelled faintly of salt and oil. But as he passed the study, he froze. The chain fragment on the desk began to rattle, slow at first, then violently. The preacher dropped his Bible, backing away. The fire in the hearth roared to life, though no match had been struck. "She's here," he said hoarsely. "You've brought her here by refusing to let her go." Devereux grabbed the fragment, shouting over the rising wind that seemed to come from nowhere. "She was mine," he bellowed. "Mine!" The preacher fled the house that night, his carriage disappearing down the long, muddy road, never to return. The colonel found himself alone once more, his voice echoing through the empty halls. That was when the lights began to flicker, one by one, as if snuffed out by unseen hands. The storm broke that night without warning. Rain slammed against the roof, thunder rolled across the bayou, and lightning carved white scars into the sky. Devereaux stood by his window, staring out into the darkness. Between flashes of light, he saw her, tall, unmoving, standing where the swamp met the fields. For a moment, he thought it was his mind playing tricks again. But then the lightning came again, and she was closer. Another flash, closer still. The final bolt struck the old oak tree near the house, splitting it down the middle. When the light faded, the figure was gone. Devereaux turned from the window and nearly dropped his pistol. The chain fragment on his desk was gone. The air smelled of burnt metal. He heard the sound then, the faint drag of iron across the floorboards. Above him. Slow, measured, coming closer. His heart pounded in his chest as he climbed the stairs, gun trembling in his grip. The hallway was dark except for the occasional flicker of lightning through the slats. He followed the sound to the end of the corridor, to the locked attic door. The rattling stopped. For several seconds, all he heard was rain. Then, the sound came again, this time from behind him. He spun, pistol raised, but there was no one there. Only the faint impression of a wet footprint on the wooden floor. He backed away slowly, pulse thundering in his ears. Another footprint appeared, then another. They were large, too large, each one pressing deeper than the last, as if something heavy was walking toward him. He fired. The shot exploded through the hall, deafening and useless. The smoke cleared, revealing nothing. Then he heard her voice, low, distant, yet somehow inside his head. "You do not own me." The pistol fell from his hands. He stumbled backward, his heel catching the edge of a loose floorboard, and he crashed against the wall. The chain fragment dropped from the ceiling above him, clattering at his feet. He reached for it, trembling, but the moment his fingers brushed the metal, it burned his skin. He screamed, the smell of seared flesh filling the air. The lights went out. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The servants who remained found the house silent. The front door stood open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. They searched each room until they reached the study. The colonel was slumped in his chair, head tilted back, eyes wide open, but empty. His skin was pale, his lips slightly parted as if he'd tried to speak before the end. In his hand was the chain fragment, fused to his palm as though melted there. Around his body, faint marks were burned into the wooden floor, circles interlaced, with smaller loops, like links overlapping. They buried him that evening, though none stayed to finish the job. Before nightfall, every remaining worker packed what little they had and left the plantation. By the next season, the house had been reclaimed by vines, its windows shattered by storms. Travelers who passed the area said they could hear something on nights when thunder rolled in. The sound of metal dragging through mud, a woman's voice whispering softly between the cracks of thunder. Years later, when the Civil War tore through, the South, soldiers passing through the ruins of Devereaux's land, found his journal among the wreckage. The last page was barely legible, written in a trembling hand. "She walks still," it read, "and when the rain comes, I hear the chains again. They are not broken, they are free." The entry ended there, the ink smeared by water stains that looked almost like fingerprints. The page smelled faintly of smoke and rust. Those who read it never forgot it, because no matter how they tried to explain it away, there was something about that last sentence that lingered long after the book was closed. An echo of chains, faint but unending, somewhere, deep within the storm. Decades passed, and the Devereaux plantation sank slowly into the swamp. The cane fields that had once fed an empire were now overgrown with moss and water lilies. The mansion's roof had collapsed inward, its grand staircase swallowed by rot and mud. Nature had reclaimed what greed once ruled, yet the locals still avoided the land. Even travelers who didn't believe in ghost stories would find their horses trembling when they neared the old property, ears pinned, eyes rolling white. They said the air there never stayed still, that it hummed faintly, as if metal were vibrating underground. When storms came, lightning struck the ruins more than anywhere else, splitting trees that dared grow too close. By the turn of the new century, only a few fragments of the story remained. Pieces whispered in the quarters, recorded in old parish books, and remembered by descendants who refused to speak the name Devereux. But Annika's name endured. Not in records, for the world erased those, but in the tongues of the free people who lived near the bayou. To them, she was not a ghost, nor merely a spirit. She was something older, a guardian of the lost, a curse for the cruel. They called her She of the Chains Unbroken. A historian named Robert Calhoun arrived in Louisiana in 1911, drawn by rumors of the Iron Widow. He was a man of reason, a skeptic who believed every legend had its root in truth. He had read old articles about the mysterious deaths on the Devereux estate, and he intended to uncover what had really happened. He hired 2 guides, local men, who spoke little during the trip. When he told them their destination, they exchanged a single look of unease. "That place don't want visitors," one said. Calhoun laughed it off. "Ghosts don't frighten me," he replied. "Only lies do." They reached the edge of the swamp at dusk. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth and decay. Insects droned in the distance, and the sky above the trees burned crimson before fading to ash. The men set up camp on a patch of high ground. The guides refused to step beyond a certain line marked by old stones. "That's her boundary," one murmured, pointing to the vine-choked fence ahead. Calhoun ignored him. He carried his lantern forward, notebook in hand, eager to document every detail. As he walked deeper into the ruins, the silence thickened. Even the frogs had gone quiet. The air pressed against him, dense and electric. His lantern flickered, though there was no wind. He passed what remained of the main gate, where rusted hinges still clung to their posts. The Devereux mansion rose from the fog like a carcass, its walls leaning, its windows hollow sockets staring into nothing. He stepped inside. The wooden floor groaned beneath him, the smell of mold and smoke filling his lungs. In what had once been the study, he found remnants of furniture half buried in dust. On the wall, the faint outline of a cross still lingered, though the wood was burned away. Then, on the floor beneath the collapsed desk, he saw something glint. He knelt and brushed away the dirt, a fragment of chain, blackened, thick, and impossibly heavy for its size. It was cold, colder than the air around it. He lifted it, and for a brief moment thought he heard something, a whisper, soft and distant, like the echo of a woman's breath. He turned sharply, but the house was empty. The swamp wind moaned through the cracks, carrying the scent of iron. He pocketed the fragment and left before night fully fell. That night, the rain began. It started as a soft drizzle, then grew violent, drumming against the tents like fists. The guides huddled together, refusing to speak. Calhoun in his tent tried to write his notes by lantern light, but his hand wouldn't stop shaking. He felt it again, the vibration, faint but steady, like the pulse of a heartbeat traveling through the ground. The chain fragment in his bag began to move, turning slowly as if alive. He reached for it, his fingers trembling, and the moment his skin touched it, the lantern went out. He heard the rain stop. Silence fell, absolute and suffocating. He thought for a moment that his ears had gone deaf. Then he heard it, the sound of metal dragging across the wet earth, somewhere just outside his tent. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. He froze. A voice followed, quiet, low, almost sorrowful. "You do not own me." The flap of his tent stirred though no wind moved. He turned toward the sound, his breath shallow. A shape stood just beyond the thin canvas wall, tall, unmoving. Lightning flashed once through the sky, illuminating a silhouette 7 feet high, shoulders broad, head tilted slightly as though listening. He screamed. The guides fled into the storm. When the rain cleared at dawn, they returned to the camp, cautiously. Calhoun's tent stood open, his papers scattered, his belongings soaked. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints except his own, but the chain fragment was gone. In the mud just beyond the tent's entrance, one of the men found a single mark pressed deep into the ground, a perfect imprint of a human foot, far too large for any man. Months later, Calhoun's journal was discovered in the archives of the Historical Society in New Orleans. The final entry was dated the night before his disappearance. His handwriting was unsteady, the ink smeared, but the words were clear. She does not haunt this place. She is this place. The air, the soil, the storm, they bend around her. The chains do not bind, they follow. And when she speaks, the earth remembers. The legend of the Iron Widow grew again after that. Hunters swore they saw her shadow rise from the marsh on stormy nights. Fishermen told of hearing chains rattling beneath the water's surface when thunder rolled across the bayou. The locals learned to leave offerings at the edge of the swamp. Bits of metal, nails, horseshoes, anything forged by fire. To keep her calm, they'd say, though none could explain why it worked. In time, scholars dismissed the story as folklore born from the horrors of slavery, a myth to give voice to pain too vast for words. But the swamp never gave up its secrets. During the floods of 1947, when parts of the land were unearthed by rising water, workers found something strange near the ruins of the plantation. 6 rusted muskets buried in a perfect circle. There, barrels bent in half as if crushed by a tremendous force. No bones, no artifacts. Only the smell of burnt metal that lingered long after the mud dried. Even now, a century later, locals still tell the tale. They say that when lightning flashes over the old Devereaux grounds, you can see her standing in the distance. Her outline, carved against the sky, chains draped like ribbons of shadow over her arms. Some say she's a ghost seeking justice. Others insist she's something beyond that. A living memory. A reckoning carved into the land itself. No one knows what became of her body, or if she ever truly died. What they do know is that nothing grows on that soil. Grass withers, tools rust, and animals shy away. The swamp keeps her story buried in its silence, yet somehow the echoes never fade. When the thunder rolls across Louisiana and the air fills with the scent of rain and iron, those who listen closely swear they can hear her voice carried on the wind. Calm, defiant, eternal. And somewhere deep within the storm, the faint clatter of chains reminds the living of a truth the past tried to bury, that even in bondage some spirits can never be broken and some names will never be forgotten. If you've stayed with us through the dark and haunting story of the 7-foot slave woman whose strength defied chains and whose fury defied death, then you already know history hides monsters, but not always the kind you expect. Some were born from cruelty, others forged by it. Her name may have been erased, her story buried under centuries of silence, but tonight, you've heard her roar echo again through time. And maybe that's the justice history never gave her. If this kind of story pulls you in, if you find yourself fascinated by the forbidden, the tragic, and the mysterious truths buried beneath history's surface, then make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Every week we uncover the forgotten chapters of human darkness, where power, fear, and fate collide. These are not just stories. They're warnings carved in blood and silence. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next descent into another shadowed corner of history, a tale that will make you question what we call justice and who really deserves to be remembered. And before you go, tell us what you think. Do you believe she was a monster shaped by pain, or a symbol of rebellion against a cruel world? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every one of them, and your voice helps keep these lost stories alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake, and never stop questioning the past.